Good morning. I am Dr. Ron Traylor, and this is History 321, Louisiana History. All right, let's begin at the beginning. That's always a good place to start with regard to history. And let's talk about uh, the early people of Louisiana, the non European people of Louisiana. What some call the indigenous people, what some call the Indians, what some call Native Americans. I don't care what you call them, as long as you understand that we're talking about the people who were here prior to the arrival of Columbus. As a matter of fact, something else that we can call these people are pre-Columbian people. Now, um, it seems as if I'm going to do this backwards. I'm going to talk about Europeans before I talk about indigenous people, but bear with me. In the year 1698, now remember this is Louisiana history. In the year 1698, Louis XIV, King of France, chose two brothers from Montreal, Canada, to lead one of history's most important expeditions. They were to found a colony that would secure France's claims to the Mississippi River Valley, and thus establish control of the entire heartland of the North American continent. Those two brothers, the older one was his given name was Pierre Lemoyne, Lemoyne. He's better known to us here in Louisiana as Iberville. Iberville was 37 years of age when he led four ships and 400 men from France to the shores of the Gulf of Mexico. His younger brother, his baby brother, whose given name was great French name, right? Jean Baptiste. Jean Baptiste. John the Baptist, right? Jean Baptiste Lemoyne was only 18 years of age. He was with his older brother. They skirted the Gulf Coast. Um, they landed first near Mobile, near Ship Island, near Dolphin Island, and on March the 3rd, 1699, which, as it worked out, was Mardi Gras Day. Iberville and Bienville pitched a camp along the banks of the Mississippi River, not far from one of the river's many mouths. Now, if you are from Louisiana, you are very aware that the Mississippi River, out down near the Gulf of Mexico, splits into several branches. Well, they pitched camp along one of those branches. It was a very modest beginning for a colony that would become known as Louisiana, named after Louis, right? Louis the 14th of France. Later, Iberville and his men built permanent settlements, first at Biloxi and then later at Mobile. So the real first permanent settlements in Louisiana were not in Louisiana. They were in Biloxi, in Mississippi, and they were at Mobile Bay in Alabama. Now, while the Lemoyne brothers, Iberville and Bienville, might have been among the first Frenchmen to call this region home, the reality is that they were not the first Louisianians. Um, for example, way up in northeast Louisiana, up near the present day town of Monroe, there is an archaeological site called Poverty Point. It's huge. It's almost as big as the pyramids of England of Europe. It's not made of stone; it's made of wood and soil, and as a result, they were called earthworks. Um, it's abandoned today. It has been abandoned for centuries, but at one time, Poverty Point was a very vital center of trade. And even today, stands as a silent testimony to the great American Indian civilizations that flourished in the Mississippi River Valley long before Iberville and Bentonville, long before the birth of Christ. Before the arrival of the European explorers, North American Indians built societies that were as diverse in many ways as the societies in the Old World. The lifeblood of those societies was the great river that they called, well, they called it different things. One of the things they called it, I think it's great, is the Father of Waters. The Louisiana Indians exhibited varying levels of social and economic sophistication. They range from the Attakapan people. Let me spell that for you. Attakapan, the Attakapan people, who generally lived over in southwest Louisiana near the present day city of Lake Charles. And all the evidence that we have suggests that they were cannibals. Now, I don't think they ate people 3 meals a day, but certainly they engaged in ritual cannibalism. Okay, so they're on one end of the scale, right? And of course, at the other end of the scale are the people from Poverty Point up in central northeastern Louisiana. I think it's in West Carroll Parish. They were the ones who created those huge earthen mounds that many archaeologists say are the remnants of temples. More than 700 archaeological sites, many with Indian mounds, were built between the year 4000. No, I didn't stutter. That was true. 4000 BC and 1500 AD. So for about 5,500 years, these Indians were building very sophisticated structures. Now, all of the Indians, all of the Native Americans, all of the indigenous people, all of the pre-Columbian people, okay, pick a name, were hunters and gatherers. Some hunted more than gathering, some gathered more than hunting, but they all were hunter gatherers. They took game such as deer and alligator and turtles and small game like rabbits and squirrels and possums and coons. They fished. Many of them lived in permanently established villages. Uh, they had weapons of stone. So these were a Stone Age people, right? A Paleolithic, that's a fancy term, a Stone Age people. But I'm here to tell you, if you've ever picked up an arrowhead and run it across your finger, you better do it very carefully, because if you're not careful, you're going to cut yourself. Those arrowheads, implements of stone, I mean, the most fundamental building material, they are razor sharp. They wore garments of mostly of fur, of skin. Now, some of them knew how to weave rudimentary cloth made from natural fibers, but it was mostly fur and skin. They created vessels of clay that they baked in ovens to make them waterproof, obviously, and very strong. Yes, they were brittle, but really, really strong. Took care of it. Um, it would literally last forever. They wove some of the most beautiful baskets that humans have ever. They literally wove these baskets out of things like pine straw and palmetto fronds. They could weave a pine straw basket that was so finely woven that it would hold water, it wouldn't leak. Some of these people were warlike, some of them were not. Those who were warlike first fought with each other, and then they fought with others. Then they fought the European explorers too. Many of the American Indians did not go quietly when the Europeans arrived. They resisted being taken over by the Europeans. Now, I said that one of the important components of this pre-Columbian civilization was trade. It's amazing. I remember how amazed I was when I read this for the first time as a college student, because no one in high school had told me this. They traded with people nearby. In other words, other villages, members of the same tribe, maybe a little further away, maybe in distant parts of Louisiana. But they also traded with people who were really far away. Evidence has been dug up by archaeologists that proves, it doesn't suggest, it proves that Louisiana Indians traded with people in Mexico. They traded with people in the southwestern part of the United States, um, places like Texas, and New Mexico, and Arizona. They traded with people as far north as the Great Plains, places like Nebraska and Iowa, places like that. So there were well-developed trade networks. Now, those were the glory days of the Native Americans in Louisiana. Today, very few Louisiana tribes remain as organized tribes. But those that do, and there are still some, those that do are recognized by the United States government as being an official tribe. They are also recognized by Louisiana government for the same reason, or both. It might be that the national government and the state government recognizes their tribal status. Now, among the largest of those tribes, then and now, are the Choctaws. Um, the Choctaw were the most numerous in Louisiana, and they were the most geographically widespread in Louisiana as well. Now, today, the Indian tribes have very little um, political impact in the state of Louisiana. But that doesn't mean that they don't have other types of impact. Um, Many of the place names that we are familiar with in the state of Louisiana are not European names at all. They are Indian names. For example, many place names take their names from Indian language, especially the Choctaw language. For example, the word bogue in Choctaw meant river or stream, right? Flowing water. Think of the places that you know that have the word bogue. How about Bogue Falaya, Bogue Chitta, right? How about Bogalusa, right? It all, um, uh, the word Ponchatoula is an Indian word that means ear of corn. If you visit Ponchatoula in the downtown area, down by the locomotive, you'll see a statue of an Indian very carefully offering an ear of corn to a deer. All right, Ponchatoula means ear of corn, and of course that reflects the importance of corn to the diet of Native Americans, including the Choctaw. We live here in Tangipahoa Parish. Tangipahoa in Choctaw means flowing or hanging hair, and is a reference to the Spanish moss. Of course, they didn't call it Spanish moss. They'd never met a Spaniard, right? They called it their own word. Uh, Tangipahoa means flowing hair, moss. Abita Springs was the home of a sort of a sub tribe of the Choctaw people called the Abitas. Um, and so these Indian words, if you understand it, these Indian words live on in Louisiana. Homa was an Indian word, for example. Now, we're not going to leave the Indians, but we're going to swap gears and swap directions and start talking about the Europeans again. Now, the first European that we know of who actually saw Louisiana didn't actually step on Louisiana soil. He saw Louisiana, but he saw it from the deck of a passing ship. He was an explorer by the name of Alonso Pineda, Pineda. In around 1519, he was sailing from the east to the west, and he made a report that he saw a huge river discharging itself into the north central Gulf of Mexico. We cannot be guaranteed that that was the Mississippi River, but we are pretty sure. Okay. Um, However, he didn't land. It would be up to future explorers to actually put boots on the ground. Um, Another Spaniard by the name of Cabeza, let me spell that one for you. Cabeza, Cabeza de Vaca, Vaca, which in Spanish means head of a cow. Don't ask me why. All I can tell you is that's the translation. Cabeza de Vaca had been shipwrecked in the Gulf of Mexico, in the northern Gulf of Mexico, and he wandered through much of this area trying to find uh, uh, safety. Now, there's no absolutely indisputable proof that he ever, excuse this hand, I can't talk without waving my hands, okay? I hope it doesn't distract you too much. There's no proof that he ever actually touched what is now Louisiana, but there's a very real likelihood that he did. Actually, whether he did or not is really unimportant. What is important is that he survived the shipwreck. He did find his way to Spanish uh, fellow Spaniards. His report made its way back to the government. And the result of that report was in 1539, another explorer was sent to the upper Gulf Coast. His name was Hernando de Soto. Now, sometimes we call him Herman de Soto. Same guy. De Soto. Desoto. De Soto and his men were the first Europeans to encounter the people of the Mississippi River, the lower Mississippi River Valley. And rather than greeting them with a handshake, he greeted them with a sword. The relationship between De Soto and the native people was a very negative relationship. In village after village, De Soto's men swept through and stole whatever they wanted to steal. And so they carried off many of the valuable belongings of the people, but they left something behind, even if they didn't know it. And what they left behind was disease, something you could not see, right? Can't see a germ, but it's just as real as it can be. They left behind diseases such as smallpox, measles, mumps. None of these diseases were previously known to the native peoples of Louisiana. And it is estimated that within a couple of generations, between 90 and 95% of all the people who were alive when the first Spaniards got here were dead. The people had absolutely no immunity to these European diseases. De Soto himself died of a fever while he was here. Uh, but that came after he was the first European to actually stand on the banks of the Mississippi. As a matter of fact, De Soto was buried in the river by his men. The survivors of his party, after he was dead, built boats by hand and floated down the river to its mouth, thus becoming the first Europeans to navigate a major portion of the lower part of the river in Louisiana. They, like Pineda, back in, what was it, 1519, made a report back to Spanish authorities. But the Spanish government was not really interested in developing the area. They considered it to be too wild and too expensive to settle. And if you are like I was when I was a young man, deer hunting and frogging in the swamps of Louisiana, you understand that was a real concern. It is even today, it is a wild place. And if you're not careful, even today, the Louisiana swamp will kill you graveyard dead, right? So, the first real exploration of Louisiana um, would pass to the French to accomplish. Even though the Spanish were the first ones here, it would be the French who actually began to settle what becomes Louisiana. But even that would take a century and a half. It didn't take place overnight, and it didn't happen quickly. But it would be the French who would eventually explore the middle half of the North American continent. So let's talk about the French exploration of North America. The French presence in North America began far to the north of what would become Louisiana. New France, as it was then called, is what we today call Canada. Right? Canada had been settled by the French initially. Canada, New France, had its beginning as in 1534, when the first French explorers got there. Now, the Spanish had already established colonies in Western Hemisphere, and the Spanish were very fortunate in that many of the places where they explored contained precious metals, especially gold, silver. Um, Spain became fabulously wealthy as a result of that. And the French thought that perhaps New France would contain gold and silver as well. Well, it sort of did. Um, the Yukon, the extreme northwestern part of Canada, did in fact contain fabulous amounts of gold, but that wouldn't be discovered for centuries. So, at the beginning of when New France was established, they very quickly discovered that there was really no precious metals there. So, the lack of precious metals led to a general disinterest in Canada. The French were asking the question, "What can you do for me?" And the answer was not much, right? No gold, no silver. But there were other sources of wealth in France, in New France, especially fur-bearing animals. You know, I have elk hunted for decades, and my clothing that I use to wear elk hunting is the best. Modern fabrics, modern insulation, all that stuff. Look, the last elk I killed, it was 19 below zero. And although I wasn't toasty warm, I was not miserable either. None of that stuff existed at the time of the establishment of New France of Canada. If you wanted to stay warm in the wintertime, you wore fur. And there were untold numbers of animals in New France that had valuable fur on their back, beaver and things like that, right? The fur trade becomes the equivalent in Canada. The fur trade becomes the equivalent of gold and silver in other parts of the New World. Many people became fabulously wealthy because of the fur trade. Now, something else provided a lot of wealth uh, at this time also. Now, remember, this was a time when the sailing ships were made of wood. And the things that a wooden sailing ship, the things that you need to build a wooden sailing ship, there's a special name for that. They're called naval, Naval, not your belly button, naval, but naval like a ship. Naval stores. That's the term. What does it take to build a wooden ship? Well, it takes oak for the body of the ship, the hull of the ship. It takes tall, straight pine trees for the mast. So uh, it takes pitch and tar to seal the cracks where the boards come together to make the ship waterproof. So naval stores, and of course, the trees of Europe had been cut down for centuries, right? It's a much older place. And as a result, it became obvious that the New World, including New France, Canada, contained many of the trees that were necessary for the naval store trade. Exploration continued, exploration grew as explorers looked for new fur bearing animals and for new sources of naval stores. Excuse me. And excuse me. Okay. In the year 1672, now look, let me stop it right here. And yes, I will be giving you dates. But the dates are not nearly as important to me as what happened on that date. Okay. What happened and why it happened is much more important to me than when it happened. Now, we need to have a general knowledge of dates to establish sort of a timeline. But on the quizzes and on the exams, I will never ask this question. What significant thing happened in 1672? However, I might ask you about something that did happen in 1672, which I'm getting ready to tell you. In 1672, a small group of explorers left Canada in search of a rumored river that connected eastern Canada to the Pacific Ocean. This was called the Northwest Passage. Let me spoil the story for you right now and tell you that no such passage exists. All right. But at that time, they thought it did. And wouldn't it be really cool to be able to travel from the Atlantic Ocean through Canada all the way to the Pacific Ocean? Think of the time and the distance it would cut off if you could find such a place. Well, anyway, this group of explorers in 1672 left Canada in search for this mythical Northwest Passage. It was led by two men. A man by the Louis, his name was Louis or Louis Joliet, Joliet, and a Jesuit, a Catholic Jesuit priest by the name of Jacques, right? Marquette, Marquett, after whom Marquette University is named today. Oh, and also a federal prison in Illinois is also named after Joliet. They floated down the Wisconsin River until it merged with the Mississippi River. And then they kept floating south. Now, what they were looking for was the Northwest Passage, which fundamentally basically ran east and west. So it didn't take them long to figure that they had found a new river, a gigantic river. They also knew that it wasn't the Northwest Passage because it was running north and south. So Joliet and Marquette become the first Europeans to call the Mississippi River the Mississippi River because that's what the local Indians called it in their language. Um, they followed the river south all the way down until they got to the point where the Arkansas River uh, runs in and empties into the Mississippi River. And that's as far south as they came. They turned around and they went home. But they had gone farther south than any other explorer had done to that point. Another Frenchman by the name of Robert Cavalier, we don't know him as Robert Cavalier, we know him as De La Salle. Is there still a De La Salle High School in New Orleans? I know there was when I was growing up. Big Catholic school. De La Salle migrated to Canada around 1667, and his goal was to get filthy rich in the fur trade. And we have already talked about how that was a common goal at that time. Once he got here, he met Louis Joliet. Joliet was back from his trip down the river with Father Marquette. Joliet told De La Salle about the Great River, and he received permission from the French king, who was still Louis XIV. Louis XIV ruled for decades and decades and decades. Of course, now, his goal in exploring the river was to find new sources of fur-bearing animals. Which he did. But in the long term, the real value of his trip down the Mississippi River was mapping. So the expedition sets out in 1682. They traveled down the Mississippi River for more than 2 months. Of course, they were on rafts and had canoes. Fundamentally, they moved at the speed of the current, right? No machines, no motors. Unlike the Spanish, remember De Soto, who had brutalized the Native Americans? De La Salle was not like that. He didn't come to make war against the Indians. He came to establish trade with them. Because when I say that De La Salle wanted to be a fur trader, I don't mean that he was out there actually trapping the animals. He tried to establish a friendly relationship with the Indians. The Indians would go out and trap the animals, skin them, right? Prepare the hides, would bring them back to the trading post, and trade the hides, trade the furs for things that they wanted, like metal pots and pans and knives and stuff. De La Salle's expedition passed the as it was heading south. It passed a place on the left, the east bank of the Mississippi River, that would someday become the city of New Orleans, but which was now just sort of a high spot that was not quite as swampy as its surrounding territory. On April 9th, 1682, of course, they always had a priest with them, right? They said Mass down in what would become Plaquemines Parish, and had a ceremony in which De La Salle claimed for Louis XIV, the King of France, all of the land drained by the Mississippi River. And if you look at a map, good Lord, that's the middle third of the North American continent. So he just claimed all that land for France. And as a result of De La Salle's journey, France now possessed what for the time was a legitimate claim to Canada, because much of Canada is drained by the Mississippi River. much of the Great Lakes area, the Ohio River, and everything that is drained by the Ohio River because the Ohio flows into the Mississippi, and that great expanse of the western United States that drains into the Missouri River, which then drains into the Mississippi River. So this was a significant result from this voyage of exploration by De La Salle. Now, De La Salle received permission from Louis XIV for a second expedition. And the purpose of that expedition was to create a French colony on the southern end of the Mississippi River. That expedition consisted of 4 ships, included soldiers and their families, because they were not going to go home again. They were going to stay right there. So, soldiers and their families, about 300 people total, men, women, and children, left France in 1684. They stopped on the way in the Caribbean to top their supplies and their fresh water off. One of the 4 ships was lost to pirates in the Caribbean, Pirates of the Caribbean, right? They then sailed into the Gulf of Mexico, but they couldn't find the mouth of the Mississippi River. Now, don't make me explain how you can miss the mouth of the Mississippi River, but they did. And they kept sailing. And they lost another ship, which sank off the coast of Texas. That's how far west they sailed after missing the mouth of the river. They lost another ship down there. So now they got 2 ships left. So they unload. They build a fort, which they call Fort St. Louis. They named it after the king. By the way, it's always good to name stuff after the guy who finances you, right? Fort St. Louis was between the present day cities of Goliad, Texas, and Victoria, Texas. Now, in 1687, now remember, La Salle's orders were to plant a colony on the Mississippi River. And even though they had missed it, in 1687, he and some of his explorers turn around and they head back east in search of the river. In March of 1687, his companions mutinied and murdered De La Salle near the present day Texas town of Navasota, which is not right by, but up near College Station, Texas, which is the home of Texas A&M University, which is where I spent and sent so much of my money sending my son and my oldest daughter to A&M. But we won't talk about that. That was a painful financial time for me. By the way, that ship that sank in Matagorda Bay, it was called the uh, La Amiable. All right, amiable, and that's a rough translation from the French, means easy to get along with. All right, he's amiable. He's easy to get along with. In 1995, that shipwreck was discovered on the floor of Matagorda Bay. It's still being explored. They're trying to raise it and protect it from the elements. The mud had preserved much of it. Many of those artifacts are on display in a museum in Victoria, Texas, near the site of Fort St. Louis. But we still haven't done much in Louisiana itself, haven't we? We've sort of been tap dancing. All these explorers have been sailing through it and they've been walking over it, but they haven't stopped and created anything of permanency. So let's once again switch gears and let's talk about the founding of French Louisiana. Now, You cannot talk about the founding of Louisiana, French Louisiana, unless you talk about some of the other nations of Europe that were also uh, desperately trying to establish colonies in North America, especially. One of those countries was England, to whom we trace our roots as a nation, right? The English had established their first successful North American colony in the year 1607 near what is now called, near what we call Jamestown, Virginia. England was a powerful nation, and the Spanish became very concerned after the establishment of the Jamestown colony. Although it was about 1,000 miles to the east, the Spanish nevertheless became very concerned about the English, and so what they decided to do was to establish a permanent presence by the French in one of the areas that they had already explored, and of course that was Louisiana. The establishment of that French colony on the Mississippi River was given to a man who probably knew more about it than anybody else. Uh, Remember our old friend Pierre Lemoyne? Uh, Iberville. Iberville commands the fleet that that is ordered to sail, find the mouth of the river, sail up the river, and find a an attractive, strategically important place to establish a colony. Now, Iberville was an interesting guy. Uh, he had been born. He was French, but he was born in Canada. Both his parents were totally French. He was totally French, but he was not born in France. He was born in Canada. He had joined the French Navy in his teens and very quickly became a hero in the French Navy, was promoted, was given all kinds of awards for bravery. So he's given command of this group whose purpose it is to establish a colony. That group of ships, the colonial ships, start from France. They start in 1698, heading west across the Atlantic Ocean. There were four ships initially. There were two larger ones, two smaller ones, about 300 men, mostly men. Um, they landed first. They sailed into the Gulf of Mexico. They landed first at Pensacola, what is now Pensacola, Florida. Now, Pensacola was under the control of the Spanish, and the Spanish discouraged the French from staying. They were not allowed to stay there, and so they sailed on, and they sailed to Mobile. The problem, of course, was that Mobile was also controlled by this time by the Spanish, and so they sail on. And as they go further west, they begin to encounter islands out in the Gulf of Mexico. They explored some of those islands. Uh, Probably the islands that they explored were what today we call the Chandeleur Islands, right? They located the mouth of the river in March of 1699. And they turned and they sailed up the Mississippi River. Of course, they're in a ship, so they can do that. They can sail against the current. Um, as they move upriver, they see a pole that's been placed in the ground and painted red. It was there as a boundary marker between two local Indian tribes. And if you've had Louisiana history, as in high school or junior high school, you'll know that the French refer to this red pole by its French name, which is Baton Rouge, right? Red stick. They continued to travel north on the Mississippi River. another, almost 3 weeks, at which point they turn around. But they don't come back the way they went. Remember, they went straight up the Mississippi River. But in the meantime, they have been talking to some of these local Indians, and the local Indians have told them about an alternate route back to the Gulf of Mexico. And so the French find the route and they take it. And it involves leaving the Mississippi River, sailing into Biomanchac, which connects to the Amite River. Of course, now the Biomanchac has pretty much been plugged up and filled in over the centuries, but at that time it was a navigable stream. So they turn off the Mississippi River into Biomanchac. They leave Biomanchac. They turn into the Amite River. The Amite River flows into Lake Marpol. All right, so they sail into Lake Marpol. Lake Marpol connects to Lake Pontchartrain. Lake Pontchartrain connects to Lake Borgne, and Lake Borgne connects to the Gulf of Mexico. So that was the route that they took on the way back. And those of you who are fishermen or shrimpers or oystermen or hunters, you have probably reproduced some, if not all, of the route that was taken by Iberville on his way back. Now, Iberville didn't really obey his instructions from the king, because the first settlement that Iberville created was not in present-day Louisiana, but in present-day Mississippi. Over near where Biloxi is today is where he established that first settlement. Now, who were those first? But it was considered to be a part of Louisiana. It's just not what we today consider a part of Louisiana. Now, who were these colonists? Well, they were mostly young, single men, very few farmers. They were mostly adventurers. That's what young men do. They go out in search of adventure. There were no women. Remember why King Louis sent Iberville out to begin with. It was to sort of deflect any British influence that might be attempted by the British government. Well, as it turned out, the French were very wise, because the British did send a sailing ship, and it did sail up the Mississippi River. But south of where New Orleans is today, Iberville's baby brother, Bienville, saw this British ship sailing north on the Mississippi River. And I think Bienville would have made a really good poker player, because he was a really good bluffer. Well, Bienville saw the British ship, so they paddle out to the British ship, and Bienville lies like a dog. What he tells the English captain was, you don't want to go much further up the river, because up the river there are a number of French battleships. And if you keep sailing, you're going to run right into them, and they are going to destroy you. Well, I suppose the English captain had no reason to disbelieve Bienville, and so he turned around and left. And to this day, the place where Bienville tells the lie to the English captain, for those of you who are from down in that part of Louisiana, we still refer to that place as English Turn. It's where the English turned and sailed away with their tail between their legs for really no reason, because Bienville lied to them. Now, the first settlement in what is now Louisiana was at a place called Fort de Boulaye, Boulaye, down near the mouth of the river. Now, the colony That was the first settlement, but that was not an important settlement. The important settlements were still over at what is now Biloxi. Um, Iberville left Louisiana for the last time in the year 1702, and he never returned. He retired. There was nothing wrong. He retired. And he died in Havana, Cuba, uh, a few years later. Now, we have said that Iberville was the commander of that first colonization attempt. When Iberville leaves, he leaves his baby brother Bienville in charge. The Louisiana colony grew very, very slowly at this time. There was a lot of disease. Uh, Matter of fact, there was famine. People were hungry. Remember, these were adventurers. These were not farmers. They were depending on somebody else to feed them, right? Oh, I'm going to go look for gold and silver, and you can feed me. Well, that didn't work. So, disease, famine, storms. We know that Louisiana is prone to these hurricanes coming in off the Gulf. Fortunately, today we know for a week or 10 days in advance when one is coming, and it gives us a chance to prepare, either to get the heck out of Dodge, right? Or to at least plywood your windows up and make sure that you have plenty of gasoline for your generator. But none of that happened back in those days. The first time that they knew a hurricane was coming was when it was there. So, storms, famine, disease. In 1704, something really important happens in Louisiana. Because in 1704, the government of France sends 23 young girls, basically, to Louisiana to serve as wives for the colonists. And this event has been memorialized in Louisiana history. Uh, each of the young girls carried a small suitcase they called it a casket, right? And all of their worldly possessions were in this little suitcase, in this little casket. And as a result, we have referred to these young women as the casket girls ever since then. And they married. Remember, the colonists were all young men. These were young women, and so they became wives for uh, the colonists. But nevertheless, the population of Louisiana, the European population of Louisiana, stayed really small for years. Bienville continued as the acting governor. Um, the colony really did not prosper, really did not prosper. And as a result, in the year 1712, a man by the name of Antoine Crozat, Crozat, Antoine Crozat, who was a very wealthy, fabulously wealthy French merchant, right? Um, he talks King Louis XIV into giving him control of the Louisiana colony. And he would have control of the colony for 15 years. Now, Crozat, from all I can gather, never actually came to Louisiana. He was sort of the guy in the background, right? What Crozat does, though, once he receives the royal charter from King Louis XIV, he hires another fella, another Antoine, by the way. Except this is Antoine Cadillac. Yes, um, the guy after whom the Cadillac automobile is named, Antoine Cadillac. Cadillac had been the founder of the city of Detroit, which explains why luxury cars made in Detroit, Michigan are called Cadillacs. If you didn't know that, I have taught you something, haven't I? So Cadillac becomes the governor of Louisiana, replacing Bienville. Cadillac, from all accounts, was a pretty good governor. He installed French law in the colony. He encouraged agriculture and trade. Of course, he had a problem with that because the settlers still didn't want to be farmers. They were still convinced that if they could just find it, there was plenty of gold and silver to dig up out of the ground. They were mistaken. But nevertheless, he encouraged agriculture. He encouraged trade. And he encouraged a man by the name of Louis Saint Denis. Now, it's pronounced Saint Denis, but it looks on paper like Saint Denis. Okay. First name, Louis, Saint Denis, ST period, DENIS. Cadillac encourages Saint Denis to establish a trading post on the Red River, northwest of the Mississippi River. Remember, if you know your Louisiana geography, you know the Red River runs into the Mississippi River. He encourages Saint Denis to establish a trading post on the Red River, and Saint Denis does that, and he establishes what a trading post, and that trading post eventually grows into the present day Louisiana town of Natchitoches. Natchitoches has the distinction of being the oldest town in not just present day Louisiana, but in the entire Louisiana Purchase that we'll talk about later, right? Created by Saint Denis on the Red River. Saint Denis went out of his way to maintain a good relationship with the Indians and with the Spanish. Now, once again, I want you to visualize a map of Louisiana. Who is our immediate neighbor to the immediate west? And that is Texas, right? Now, who owned Texas? The Spanish. If you look at a map, you'll see that Natchitoches is rather close to the Texas state line, which means that there was an interplay and interaction regularly between the French settlers at Natchitoches and the Spanish settlers in Texas. And Saint Denis understood it was really important to maintain a good working relationship. It's always better to help your neighbors than it is to fight your neighbors. Now, Crozat, even though he wasn't here, he was working behind the scenes in France. Crozat was responsible for importing the first slaves into the Louisiana colony. Now, we don't know exactly what year that happened, but we think it was around 1717. Now, Crozat and Cadillac are separated by thousands of miles, right? Crozat has the mistaken idea that Cadillac is not a really good governor. And so he relieves Cadillac and replaces him with a fellow by the name of Jean Lepinay, Lepinay. And that was probably a mistake because the people of Louisiana, if Cadillac was going to be replaced anyway, they would have preferred to get Bienville back because Bienville had been a really good governor. And so the settlers in Louisiana sort of split politically, if you will, between those who supported Bienville returning as the governor and those who supported Lepinay. Of course, there were still not a lot of people to argue with each other because as late as 1717, there were still only about 700 colonists in all of Louisiana. Now, Crozat lost a lot of money in Louisiana. And it wasn't long before he begged Louis XIV, please let me out of this deal. Louis, by this time, was dead, and he'd been replaced by Louis XV. And we'll say more about Louis the 15th in the next lecture. Um, but as a result of Lepine fundamentally wins that argument. All right. Oh, excuse me. Okay, that's 1 hour lecture. I'm going to try to keep these to about an hour. So let me stop it right here. This has been lecture one, History 321, Louisiana history. And we will pick up with lecture two, hopefully, right where lecture one is. So for right now, I'll say goodbye. Maybe not. Hmm. Hang in there with me, folks.